Let me just introduce Professor Huxtable before he starts his talk. Professor Huxtable is Professor of Medical Ethics and Law from the University of Bristol, and his research primarily concerns legal and ethical issues at end-of-life decision-making, surgery, and paediatrics. He's the author of countless books and an old friend of the department and the Centers program. He's been here with us many times, so we're sorry that he can't be. So without further ado, may I ask the team to please start Professor Huxtable's talk. And once again, welcome to the conference, and I hope you enjoy the next 2 days. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm very sad and sorry indeed not to be there in person with you, not least to catch up with Sumi, Mikey, and of course, all of the CBME crowd, but also because the topic of your conference speaks to two huge interests of mine. One is, of course, the primary topic of the best interests of the person who is said to lack capacity. But secondly, also, I do a good deal of work with UK clinical ethics committees, including as chair of the UK Clinical Ethics Network. So doubly sad not to be with you today, but thank you all for your understanding. My health is improving and I hope to be with you in Singapore later in the year, fingers crossed. But on to today, I'll be talking to the title In the Best Interests of the Patient and reflecting on best interest decision-making, particularly in healthcare in the jurisdiction in which I work, England and Wales. My name is Richard Huxtable. I'm Professor of Medical Ethics and Law at the Centre for Ethics in Medicine at the University of Bristol, based in the medical school. And along with colleagues here at Bristol, which I'll say more about in a moment, we've been running a project since 2018 looking at best interest decision-making across the life course. So including both children, very young children, all the way through to older adults. And I'll draw on some of what we're finding throughout this discussion. I should initially start with some acknowledgements and indeed declarations, and I should emphasize that the views I'll express here today are developing and emerging views. This is very much work in progress, but also any asides from me are very much from me. They're my own views, not necessarily those of my colleagues or the organizations with which I work. I'll be talking particularly to some of our work on the project I just mentioned, that's Balancing Best Interests in Healthcare, Ethics and Law, otherwise known as the Babel Project. And this is a project kindly supported by the Wellcome Trust, a major funder in the UK, and it's work undertaken with a range of colleagues here in the Centre for Ethics in Medicine and also in the law school. And I'll particularly mention Emanuele Valenti, Jonathan Ives and Giles Birchley, with whom I work closely on some of the data I'm going to share with you. And I've also had a range, and indeed still have a range of roles on various organisations and ethics committees. But as I say, the views I'll offer up here are very much my own views on what we're talking about. To put the Babel project in a bit more context, this is a large piece of work running just about 6 years in total, finishing later this year. And our overarching question is, how should the best interests of incapacitated or incompetent patients be interpreted and applied in medico-legal decision-making? And we refer to medico-legal decision-making because we want to capture decisions in the healthcare world around treatment or indeed not treatment, but also decisions taken in the legal world around the best interests of such patients. And our approach to the project involves 3 phases, each in turn, but somewhat iterative. This is an approach we've published, myself and John Ives, in BMC Medical Ethics back in 2019. And we refer to this as the mapping, framing, and shaping approach. And this really just gives a structure to the project. So dealing with our first metaphor, more metaphors will feature, the mapping phase, the first phase, involves surveying the general terrain, essentially through literature reviews, where our focus is on what the nature and purpose of this best interests idea is all about. In the second phase, framing, we then study areas of that terrain in much more depth and detail, particularly through qualitative research, both interviews and focus groups. And here we're essentially asking, how does this best interest standard currently operate in decision-making, both in the law world and in the healthcare world? And then in the third phase, and this is the phase we're just about entering now, we're looking at shaping things. In other words, we're looking to shape or indeed reshape the terrain that we've been studying. In other words, in classic bioethical terms, we're looking to develop recommendations, whether these are for patients, for healthcare professionals, or indeed for legal professionals. So essentially there we're asking, how should the best interest standard operate in decision-making going forward? And all of this is essentially empirical bioethics research, albeit with some legal flavour, some socio-legal flavours as well. But in terms of the empirical bioethics approach, we're very much guided by work undertaken and published by John Ives, as mentioned at the bottom of the slide. His approach is known as reflexive balancing, and it's a model where you consult with various stakeholders and seek to bring together what they're saying with what the researchers are thinking, with what the arguments are saying, to try and shape recommendations. That's the approach in overview, but I'm going to tell you a bit more about some aspects of it, albeit I won't be able to speak to the whole project. But in terms of what I will be able to speak to, I'll start by briefly setting the scene, telling you about the headlines of the law in England and Wales, before then moving on to some of the findings from our literature searches, particularly a literature search around empirical evidence of what's currently happening, or at least at that point in time was happening, in healthcare in England and Wales. I'll then, in the third phase, move to tell you some of what our participants were saying. And this was a wide range of participants involving various healthcare professionals, but also patients, family members, and others close to them. And then I'll close with some brief discussion points. And indeed, I'll be interested in hearing more in due course, whether by email or when I finally get to see you all in Singapore, about what these findings might tell us and what indeed might be the future direction of travel. And that speaks to that metaphor on that fourth slide, another metaphor for you, the idea of taking flight and finding a direction of travel. And that was a picture I took on my last visit to Singapore, 2017, when I visited the bird park. Anyway, to business. So first of all, to set the scene, let's talk about the basic legal framework. And it's the legal framework that I'm sure you'll be familiar with to an extent, not least because there are echoes of the framework in England and Wales in your laws in Singapore, in your Mental Capacity Act of 2008, and to some extent your Advanced Medical Directive law of 1996. But I'll focus first of all on what the law in England and Wales says so you can see the findings in context. So our key piece of legislation, just a few years before yours, is the Mental Capacity Act of 2005 that came into effect in 2007. And the Act starts off with some core principles, which I've summarised here. The first of which is, if we're dealing with an adult patient, and that will primarily be my focus today, then we should presume that that patient has capacity. And in terms of adults in English law, they are 18 years and over, although some aspects of the Act refer to 16 and 17-year-olds as well. But job number one is presume that the adult patient does have capacity to make a decision about their treatment. But if there is any doubt, then their capacity can be tested. Secondly, even if someone is found rather to lack capacity, then we should be supporting adults to make their own decisions. Thirdly, if the person makes what we, for example, as a clinician, consider to be an unwise decision, that doesn't necessarily mean that they lack the capacity to make that decision. Fourthly, a decision must be made for the patient, P, lacking capacity, in their best interests. And this, of course, is the key concept that will run through my presentation, but also everything you'll discuss in the next few days. And then finally, any choice made for the person who lacks capacity must be least restrictive of their rights and freedoms. So a good deal of this hinges on whether or not the person has capacity to make the relevant decision. And the Act states that if the person is 16 and over, then we are, number one, to presume capacity, as we've just heard. But if in doubt, we can go ahead and test. And according to the legal test in the Mental Capacity Act, a patient lacks capacity if, first of all, the functional test, they're unable to make or communicate a decision. That is, they're unable to understand, retain, use, or weigh up relevant information, and then communicate their decision by whatever means. That's the first element. And our judges have confirmed that that is indeed the first step. Only then do you secondly move to the diagnostic test, where the inability to make or communicate the decision is due to an impairment of or a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain. And the Act then provides, as indeed do the judges, various pointers. So capacity is decision specific and indeed time specific. It can be present even if the person can only retain the relevant information for a short period of time, which of course we understand is the case for many of us. It can also be present even if, as I said a moment ago, the person makes what we consider to be an unwise decision. Incapacity may also be permanent. Think perhaps the permanent vegetative state, to use the older language, or it may be temporary and indeed reversible. And finally, incapacity should not be assumed. So we should avoid any bias or prejudice based, for example, on a person's age, appearance, their medical condition or diagnosis. Rather, capacity is decision specific and indeed person specific. Moving on, if we assume that we have a patient who has been found to lack capacity to make the relevant decision, then a decision must still be made on essentially one of initially three bases, but the fourth is the one that I'll move to quite swiftly. But briefly to say, a decision may be based on what we call in our law an advanced decision to refuse treatment. Now, this is restricted to adults, so 18 and over. And essentially, if a person sets down their wishes at a time when they have the capacity to do so, and what they set down is valid and applies to the situation now arising, then that advanced decision should, indeed must, be respected. And then there are further requirements if the decision in question is to apply to life-sustaining treatment. So it must be written, it must be signed, it must be witnessed. Alternatively, or additionally, the person may appoint a lasting power of attorney, sometimes called a welfare attorney. Again, this is reserved for adults, and that person may be empowered to consent or refuse treatment on behalf of the patient. And that might include life-sustaining treatment if the person has been specifically authorized to do so. And then finally, there may be situations where a person has serious or enduring lack of capacity and there are major decisions to be made. In those cases, the court might appoint a deputy to make a range of decisions, but there are some limits on their powers. But otherwise, and indeed this operates generally as a boundary, decisions should be oriented to, based on, the person's best interests. And that's really going to be my main focus. In terms of these two little words, best interests, there's no single definition, certainly not in our laws. And I should also note here that I will occasionally refer to the framework around children. And indeed, the same two little words feature in the law governing the treatment of children, at least in England and Wales, but I know in many other legal systems as well. So it's a very common phrase. We see it indeed internationally. But there's no clear legal definition. Rather, the most our Act does is provide a checklist of factors to consider. And these include the person's past and present wishes and feelings, any beliefs and values they have or indeed had that might be influential over the relevant decision, and indeed any other factors that the person themselves would consider if they were able to do so. And the judges have further amplified that best interests is a broad and wide concept that should encompass all that's relevant to this person's treatment decision. So we have Lady Hale, indeed the former Chancellor of the University of Bristol, saying in a judgment 10 years ago that we should look at the patient's welfare in the widest sense, not just medical, but social and psychological. Consider the nature of the treatment in question, what it involves, its prospects of success, the outcome of that treatment for the patient. Try and put yourself in the shoes of the individual patient themselves and ask what is it that they would decide if they were able to do so. and indeed consult others who are looking after or concerned or caring for that person, in particular for their view of what the person would say if we could indeed consult them. And further pointers have been offered again in the Act, but also in various judgments around ensuring that we do look to what the person's views are, but with something of a boundary around this. Patients cannot demand and expect that their demands will be met. But we should certainly be encouraging patients' participation. We should also be waiting if there is a good chance the person's capacity will be recovered, such that we can wait until a time when they can make the decision. We should, as we saw on the earlier slide, avoid making prejudicial assumptions. But there's also, in addition to these concerns with justice, equity, and indeed respect for the autonomy of the person, there are also some concerns with ensuring that the value of life is protected and respected. So within the Act, we also see a reference to if the decision is about life-sustaining treatment, then the person making the decision, the doctor, for example, should not be motivated by a desire to bring about that patient's death. And finally, in terms of this protection of life, if there is an emergency, then there should be a presumption in favour of saving life where possible, unless, of course, there is a clear, valid and applicable advance decision suggesting that treatment should not go ahead. But those are amongst some of the key pointers in terms of what this concept is and some of the things to think about, legally at least, when dealing with the concept. And in terms of consultation, which has come up a couple of times, if there isn't this LPA, the lasting power of attorney or welfare attorney, or indeed if there isn't a court-appointed deputy, then it's very likely in practice that it will be the responsible clinician who makes the ultimate decision. But they are still obliged to consult appropriately, even in the absence of these other legal entities. So they should certainly be consulting the person themselves. We should remember that merely because someone's found to lack capacity for a particular decision does not mean that we don't engage with them, speak with them, learn their views and values. Rather, they can still contribute in potentially important ways. The decision maker should also be consulting anyone named by the patient, and indeed anyone interested in the welfare of that patient or generally caring for them. And if there is no such person or no such people, then there is a service, the Independent Mental Capacity Advocate Service, which may be able to assist, certainly in cases involving serious medical treatment. So if there's no one else, this person might be able to give a view more broadly on what the person's best interests might be. And then in terms of process, if we look somewhat beyond law to some of the professional medical guidance, not least from the British Medical Association, example at the bottom of the slide there, then guidance suggests a few other pointers in terms of process, or indeed processes, plural. First of all, in line with some of what the courts do, there's a suggestion that we should balance and weigh different factors when seeking to reach a decision in the best interests of the patient. One way of doing this, which the courts have long done, and now the British Medical Association is suggesting doctors themselves might wish to do, is to set up what's called a balance sheet. Example of that on the right of the slide there. Some information about the patient, but also about the treatment options, and importantly about the respective pros and cons of those, and then the reasoning for why the particular decision was reached. This might be a good way of listing out, thinking through, weighing up the different factors, given that there may be so many factors in play. A second element in terms of process is the relevance and sometimes importance of holding what are often called best interests meetings. And these will involve a range of stakeholders, particularly health and other professionals, but also potentially the patient themselves and indeed those close to them. And then other pointers include ensuring that decisions are accurately recorded and indeed reviewed and changed where appropriate. And finally, and this is certainly a message the courts are very clear about, ensuring that any disputes are resolved promptly. Well, so much for the legal framework. I'll tell you a little bit about what we found in terms of the literature on empirical studies to date. So we asked in one of our reviews, which is the main one I'll focus on here, how are best interest decisions being made in healthcare practice? And this involved a range of subordinate questions, other questions around who's involved, what are the pros and cons or barriers and enablers, are there observable differences between different patient groups, contexts, or professionals? But our key question was really just to get a sense, how are decisions being made? What's going on if we look inside this black box of best interest decision making? We looked to two databases, they're on the slide there, over around about a 12-month period, using a range of keywords which I won't talk through here. And we were particularly interested in hearing from empirical studies, whatever methods they used, very much a national focus in view of legal differences, including in the UK. So we focused on a single jurisdiction, England and Wales. Papers would be in the English language. They would be focused on healthcare, so treatment decisions and indeed healthcare settings, and would involve a range of stakeholders. We were very open in terms of who the studies were of. So it might be doctors, nurses, patients, family members, potentially social workers in the healthcare space. So that's what we were looking for. What did we find? Well, we thematically analysed the papers that were returned and we focused sharply on 33 outputs. And we found three themes. The first, capturing factors contributing to BIDs, as I put it here, best interest decisions. And essentially here we found, much like we saw a moment ago, best interest is not a single concept. Rather, it's made up of a variety of diverse factors, and its meaning depends on who the decision maker or decision makers are in the individual situation. The second theme focuses on best interest decision making as a process and suggests some ways in which processes and indeed the people involved, the participants in the process, influence the decisions that are made and indeed the outcomes of those decisions. And our final theme captures both those things that can help best interest decision making and those things that can hinder it, so barriers and facilitators. So I'll give you some illustrations of each of these themes now, and I've given some of the original references, but not all of them, but they will be published hopefully in the coming months. So if we start with our first theme, factors contributing to best interest decisions, then as I mentioned, this essentially conveys that best interest is not a single or uniform concept. Rather, it captures lots of different considerations, factors, components. And its meaning, and indeed the relative weight of these different meanings, depend on who's involved and who ultimately is deciding. So four key examples on the slide here, sub-themes. The first of these is around medical necessity, where there are certainly medical components to making a best interest decision in terms of who the patient is, in terms of their symptoms, their diagnosis, their prognosis, also in terms of treatment options, and indeed in terms of possible or anticipated outcomes. So we have an example from a paramedic here saying that generally you go on what you think is medically necessary for this patient, but with the least disruption possible. A second example would be minimizing harm as a sub-theme. And this is where there are concerns, understandable concerns, with minimizing risks to life or limb or to life and well-being, but also to minimizing any psychological, emotional, or indeed other impacts on the person themselves. So we had at least one pediatrician in this example expressing concerns about the risks of harm to a child patient because their parents or their family more broadly couldn't treat the child normally. Every time they had a headache, they took it to casualty or the emergency department. They were medicalizing the child. And the implication strongly there from this participant is that this would expose the child to risk of harm, something to be avoided if we're to make a best interest decision. So in terms of putting things more positively, we then move into this idea of quality of life, where factors include, of course, the clinical evidence, but also some reference to what the patient would consider to be a good or positive quality of life, and thinking about broadly that balance of benefits to burdens to the patient. So we have a study here, indeed, by my colleague in Bristol, Giles Birchley, saying from a mother's perspective, it should be more to do with the child's well-being and quality of life than the parent's well-being and quality of life. It should really be centered on them, the patient, rather than the parents. And then finally, and implicit in that previous account, we have notions of autonomy or self-rule. So the importance of listening to the patient, respecting their views and values when seeking to make a best interest decision. This somehow goes into the melting pot. So we have here a general medicine doctor saying that advanced decisions are a good idea. This is a pro-autonomy statement. And I think it's a good idea as a doctor. I'd assume it would make decision-making a lot easier if everybody had set out quite clearly what they wish before they became mentally incapacitated. So you certainly get a sense from these sub-themes and this overarching theme that there's a lot of potential considerations to a best interest decision, according to studies so far. And studies so far also point to best interest decision-making as a process. So this captures how different processes and indeed different participants influence the decisions made and the outcomes. And I've separated this broadly into two groups. First of all, emphasizing the role of healthcare professionals particularly. So relevant features in terms of their input include their skills in communicating with the patient and those close to the patient, their own values and indeed their own beliefs, and moreover, their own emotions. That word emotion will come up again later. So we have, for example, a parent saying, I think I, as a parent, would have done anything the professionals, the healthcare professionals said. I was that anxious over the baby. Then you have a doctor saying, I think sometimes as a doctor, we're always focusing on getting people better. But then you realize that everyone's going to die. It's just as rewarding to help someone die comfortably in the way that they would want to. And that, we think, certainly expresses some of the values that doctors might bring to these decisions, in turn influencing them. And of course, decisions are also influenced by processes, including this idea of meetings that I mentioned earlier. So meetings have value and inform the decisions made through sharing and communicating different perspectives, including from different professional groups. And the approaches used by professionals also vary, sometimes seeking to inform, sometimes seeking to persuade, sometimes seeking to support. And of course, all of that might influence the ultimate decision made. So you have an end-of-life care doctor, again, in both of these examples, saying there's a routine meeting to decide which way to go. And then in the second, noting that sometimes meetings don't entirely help, or indeed can't entirely be feasible. You can't leave it a week to get round and sit down and make a decision. But if you have someone in your own home there and then, you can't fiddle about, wait for the GP, and so on. So sometimes processes help or hinder and certainly influence, but sometimes, of course, the processes might not be entirely feasible. And then thirdly, we move to barriers and facilitators to best interest decision. These are the various factors that can ease or impede decision-making. If we start with the barriers, then we noted various barriers. The first is the law itself. And we heard various things from these previous studies about how sometimes the law doesn't seem to actually capture well or sit well with actual clinical practice. So, for example, if you think of the independent mental capacity advocate service I mentioned earlier, then you have an intensive care doctor saying, well, advocacy won't be feasible in most intensive care units, where treatment's often required urgently or patients' medical conditions can change quickly. So something of a question there about whether the law accurately can speak to the reality in particular settings, at least. A second barrier or obstacle, and certainly a concern expressed by various professional participants, is that there will be situations where it's simply difficult to avoid the patient coming to some level of harm. So amongst the harms and risks that the paramedic is concerned about is whether, for example, when transferring an older person, whether you think the nursing home they're going to is a safe place to leave them, either based on your experience of that nursing home or just on an assessment of the handover that you get. And there's a sense there that they need to do their job, they need to hand over the patient, but they've got these lingering concerns. Is this absolutely the safest environment for them? Sometimes, as another barrier, they refer to a lack of information being available in order to make the relevant decision. And sometimes, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, emotion comes into this. There may be, at a minimum, distress on the part of some of the participants in the process. So parents, for example, in this quotation, might express terror about what it is that's happening with their child. And a further barrier to reaching a decision, or certainly an obstacle, is when conflict emerges, whether it's between professionals or, perhaps more common, between professionals and families. But it's not all gloomy news. There are also different things that the literature suggests can help ease decision-making in the best interests of the patient. So the presence of some form of community support to the patient and perhaps others, ways of assessing or accessing rather the patient's narrative, getting a sense of who this patient is so that any decision that is made is close to the decision they themselves would make. So as the Luke study refers to, by obtaining additional information about the patient and providing the team with a better picture of what the patient would have wanted. Furthermore, teamworking, multidisciplinary teamworking in healthcare can also help to reach a best interest decision. And then finally, training comes up quite a few times, where you have professionals referring to either official formal training, such as training courses, or simply to having local experts available to them, as is the example given by the Chatfield study. So one of my consultant colleagues was working at the national level on, this is a typo, the Mental Health Capacity Act by the participants. So Mental Capacity Act, they mean. And through her, we had a very informed and updated briefing. So those sorts of things can help to inform, educate, and ultimately empower clinicians in terms of acting and behaving in line with the law. So that's some of what the existing studies found. What then about our own study? And as I say, there are various parts to it, but we also have gone out and interviewed a range of participants in the healthcare world, or worlds plural. And here we're essentially asking, how does the best interest standard currently operate? How do we think it actually operates? And again, we have similar questions to those we had for the literature review I mentioned. So what are the factors? Who contributes? What are the enablers and barriers? And what are the processes used? And in terms of who we wish to speak to, we wanted people with experience of best interest decision-making. And that was across the life course, although I'll primarily talk about the data in relation to adults. But that experience the people might have had might be as a patient, a professional, a carer, a family member. We were sampling proposedly, so we were looking to have, for example, a fair gender balance, a mix of professions, a mix of patients, settings, and the like. And in terms of how we collected the data I'm talking about right here, we had 22 semi-structured interviews, and we ran 3 focus groups. And there were other data collection activities, but that's my focus right now. And the participants I'm speaking about include 15 professionals, a range of them, 6 patients across the life course, and 13 relatives or people close to patients. And this was, of course, qualitative research, and we undertook, led by my colleague Emmanuel, reflexive thematic analysis, so developed codes from which we developed themes. And I'm going to talk to you about 5 of those themes using an extended metaphor. And the extended metaphor is that of an orchestra. So there are 5 themes I want to talk to, each of them pushing this metaphor. Hopefully you'll remain with me. I'll try and put it metaphorically initially and then more directly thereafter. So the first sub-theme is indeed the orchestra of best interest decision-making. This is about the people involved. It's about their roles, responsibilities, expectations, and perceptions. The second is about communication and how this is both the source of problems, dissensus, disagreement, but also can be the source of reaching agreement. The third is about drivers of the decision, so how values and emotions drive the determination of best interests. The fourth, which introduced me to a word which I now have adopted, best interest is polysemous and pluralistic. I'll come back to that. And then the final, somewhat echoing the literature review earlier, is about when and how best interest decision-making fails in terms of different deficits or failures. And as I say, all of this will be linked by an extended orchestra metaphor. So we'll dive into the first theme. So the first theme is indeed the orchestra of best interest decision-making, and metaphorically, this is about different participants coming together with the aim of producing a harmonious piece of music, a harmonious symphony, if you like. But what we see is, in producing that symphony, people have different roles and associated responsibilities, and indeed different expectations of what their role should be and what the roles of others should be. And for today's purposes, I've separated this orchestra element into three groups of roles. First of all, we have the conductors. Those are the people who have the authority. Ultimately, they will be the decision makers. But they also, in having that authority, acquire responsibility with some of the burdens that that might impose. And what's very striking to just talk across this data set is that broadly it's seen that clinicians, the responsible doctor, tend to be the decision makers. They tend to be the conductors. But other people themselves might become conductors in some situations, or they might wish to be the conductor, even if it's still ultimately the doctor who is. So to broadly illustrate that, we have a social worker talking about it being helpful to have one decision maker in terms of the person who has accountability, and for it to be clear who's the one putting together all the different factors and making the decision. And they concede that obviously in a way you're making the decision together, but they still, to go to the top again, are saying having one decision maker is clear. And they imply, as various others state, this tends to be the doctor. However, if you look to the parents, number 38 there, this parent is saying, if my son could say no, that would mean no. But because he can't say no, I say no on his behalf, or yes on his behalf. I generally find that sometimes doctors don't take on board what parents say, and because of this, it takes longer to get children's support. So you have at least a parent there saying, sometimes it should be the child who's the conductor, and sometimes indeed it should be the parent who is. And indeed other patients say similarly. You have an adult patient saying, I'm a pretty stroppy, stubborn customer. I like to be in charge. Equally, we have a younger patient this time saying, if it's a choice, then I think the child should have a say in it. And if they're saying no, that should be respected. And then finally, we have a lasting power of attorney saying, I really struggle with the fact that I'm taking care of my family members as I have lasting power of attorney. So that sense in the last one is, there are different people vying for authority, but sometimes this authority brings not only responsibility, but also burden. But there are, of course, other roles in an orchestra. Most crucially, the musicians themselves. So this means we have various participants who are contributing as members of the ensemble. And some of them might have more or less of a role in that ensemble. For example, somewhat akin to a first violinist. That tends to be the case for the lasting power of attorney. I'll come to that. But broadly, in terms of various musicians being involved, you have the nurse noting it's a shared responsibility. It's never just on one person. Well, it shouldn't be just on one person. And we work in teams for reasons such as these, don't we? So since this is a collective endeavor, everyone playing parts of the music. The pediatrician then saying the parents were incredible. So the parents play a role as musicians as well. They say it was a unanimous decision they reached, particularly in that case on withdrawing life-sustaining treatment from the parent's young child. So we presented that as our view to the parents, so they didn't feel as though it was their decision to withdraw. So this sense that the parents on this account were part of the ensemble, but weren't the ones conducting it, or indeed the ones writing the score. And then in terms of the power of attorney, you have a social worker noting, well, if someone has this power of attorney, that makes it simpler. You're the decision maker. So the LPA is the decision maker. That may not mean in every case, in every situation, but sometimes these people will acquire the key amount of authority. And then finally, if we are sticking with this orchestra, there are, of course, people who tend to be watching the orchestra. And so there are various stakeholders who may be more like audience members watching the performance, or indeed for whom the performance is being performed. They are the ones seeking to benefit from the performance. They may be more or less passive. Some of them might be more active. Indeed, some of them might be more like music critics, coming in, commenting from the sidelines in the hope that their comments will help improve the performance. So a few illustrations of that. You've got an adult patient saying, well, I was certainly weighing things up when the decision was made on their behalf, but I was also willing to go along with whatever the overwhelming medical advice was. And more of a passive role there. Others are making the decision for the benefit of that person. In terms of the IMCA, they are saying, I try to be the person from their point of view. In other words, I, as an independent advocate, seek to step into the person's shoes. A daughter of an adult patient saying that she finds she's the one who's more like a music critic. So when the doctors arrive at her father's house to provide him with care, I'm playing good cop, bad cop. My dad, the patient in this case, is the good cop who says hello to everybody when they come in the house. I'm the evil daughter in the background going, you're not doing that right. And then finally, we have another LPA saying that their neighbour actually was incredibly helpful in helping them put trust in someone so that they, the LPA, could be there not merely as an LPA, but as their mother's daughter. So more or less passive roles, but a sense that it's others who are doing the deciding in these sorts of quotations, at least. That's our first theme, the theme of the orchestra, the roles and expectations of the different people. Then we move to communication, and I'll do the remaining themes much more briefly. In terms of communication, the sense is that misunderstandings and miscommunication might mar an orchestra's performance. But an orchestra can perform best if the musicians are communicating well and indeed playing the same sheet music. So put more directly, this is about how sometimes communication can be a source of problems, a source of disagreements indeed, but it can also sow the seeds for reaching agreement and removing problems. So if we start with communication as a source of disputes and disagreements, then it might be between professionals and families. For example, we have number 29 saying that sometimes the interpretations by care professionals on what a person wants differs hugely from what the family considered they would want in those circumstances. But sometimes, people drift apart from their families or don't spend that much time with their families. So a sense that sometimes in this one, indeed, it's not merely patients and professionals having different views, but potentially the family also having different views from those that the patient themselves might hold. Then we have disputes or disagreements or difficulties, at least, arising between professionals and different professional groupings. And sometimes this hinges on failures in communication of some description or other. So you have a doc saying it can be problematic in that if someone has particular views that are very different to the rest of the team, and they refer actually to cultural differences. So in my department, there are some consultants from overseas. They always say that everybody should have cardiopulmonary resuscitation and that everybody should be for intensive care. And they acknowledge that when there's conflict within the team, it does make it very messy. But sometimes the mess can be avoided or cleaned up through communication and investment in particular, certain communication strategies and communication skills. So, for example, tailoring information, so avoiding some of the medical jargon, as the paediatrician 25 mentions, and also adopting certain communication values, if you like, transparency, honesty, inclusivity, empathy, and others. So we have a paramedic saying, I think you need to be honest with parents. I think your duty as a healthcare professional is just to be very transparent about your decision-making, transparent about the risks and the benefits, or the fact that there might not be any. From there, we move to our third theme, driving the decision, how values and emotions drive the determination of best interests. And this is really conveying how, much as with an orchestra, the values and emotions of the performers will influence the performance they produce. So in terms of values, again, some resonance with our literature. There are various values that seem to feature that can influence the direction of the decision made. So a sense of sometimes it's about decisions for the good of the patient's well-being, in other words. You have an IMCA referring to balancing together various things, including their mental well-being, physical well-being, social well-being. In addition to, and potentially separate from this, we have concern with ensuring that we do that which the patient themselves would have wanted. So honouring their wishes and values. So the patient, number 42, saying, well, I guess if you knew them, like putting yourself in their shoes, and if you know them well enough, you can kind of assume their decision they make. But strikingly also, we found emotion featuring in quite a lot of our data. And in particular, the emotions of those close to the patient, particularly family members, but sometimes also the professionals, can have an influence on the decision made. So for example, we have lasting power of attorney saying, I think the relatives, just argue out of sentiment, out of emotion, and I listen to them as they speak because I understand they're trying to give general advice. But it's based on emotions and personal connection and more of an empathy. And the fact that, it's foreseeable in such a close relationship that people really will, it's in them, it's innate, it's inbuilt to want to take care of their loved ones' best interests. So emotions playing a role in addition to any values the decision makers bring to the decision. And a mother recognizes that the emotions can be more negative, if you like. Making decisions is hard, especially when you make a lot of, it's like the emotional load, isn't it? It's just adding another load on, so you have to make your own decisions in life, and then you have to make decisions for somebody else. So emotions doing some work here as well. And then we come to our classic word here, polysemous and pluralistic. So best interests as polysemous and pluralistic, where polysemous means many possible meanings coexist of this single phrase, best interests. So there are diverse but related ways of understanding the concept. In other words, going back to our metaphor, orchestra members might interpret a composition or a score in particular and distinct ways, but a performance should seek to bring the diverse instruments and interpretations together. And so what we see is there are different legal, professional, and procedural or processual accounts of best interests. There are also more everyday or colloquial accounts, but ultimately, as various participants suggested, best interests should try and bring all of these different accounts together in a holistic sense. So briefly to illustrate, on the legal, professional, and processual accounts, you have number 44, an ICU doctor, very much having a legal sense of best interests in mind. So we talk about technical, more concrete things like saying this person lacks capacity under the Mental Capacity Act, so under Section 2, ... So quite a legal interpretation. We also see legal, professional, and furthermore procedural accounts in what the social worker says about how, on a day-to-day basis, outside of being in the profession, best interest you might think of as you're deciding what you think is best for that person, so a more everyday sense. Maybe it's what's going to keep them safe, maybe it's what's going to keep them well. But then you bring in the legal and the like. So whereas maybe looking at it in terms of the legal framework, it's much more about considering all those factors and what the person might decide for themselves. So a real broad sense of the different accounts there, but moving towards the legal and professional understanding. Colloquial accounts also feature in the paediatrician's observation, although they think the colloquial everyday term is less helpful. And I think crucially they say it's just that people have different understandings of what best interests are probably within their roles. So it can become a little bit difficult to communicate ideas in a way that we're all understanding the same thing. We'll return to this. But at least for the same paediatrician, and indeed others, there is a sense that the ideally best interest decision should bring all of these diverse accounts together in a holistic way. So they're actually dealing with children, but I think their comments resonate with some of the data around adults. And it's the idea that the situation for every child, for every patient, is going to be different. I think that's the beauty of the best interest decision-making process because it's holistic. It takes into account even the smallest things, which on the face of it don't seem important. And then we come finally to some of the failures. So where best interest decision-making can go wrong in different senses. And the different senses include legal, procedural, informational and systemic failures or deficits or lacks. Essentially, metaphorically, what we're saying here is the quality of a performance turns on certainly the quality or clarity of the composition or score, but also on the players being skilled and having practiced, on the instruments being tuned, the sheet music being available, the instruments being available, and so on and so forth. So put more directly, you have some people saying, well, there's problems with the legal framework. It doesn't speak to practice, or others saying, well, the legal framework's there. It's just people aren't using it or aren't aware of it. Secondly, we certainly found a great many people saying there are problems with getting the requisite information in order to reach the decision. So, for example, at the bottom of 29, saying no one gets back to you, you don't know what's happened, and so on. And very sadly, and certainly quite acute at present, I would suggest, is of course the pressures generally created by resource deficits. So an intensive care doctor saying, well, there are 20 patients on a ward, you have to make a decision quite rapidly. Furthermore, of course, you have the imposition of COVID and the impact that's had on resources and availability. But even beyond that, you have concerns expressed by this carer about whether the professionals had enough time to get to know the patient and their notes and so on. So various ways in which things can and sadly do go wrong. So where does that leave us? Well, I will do this fairly briefly because this is where really we are still in progress. The analysis of this latter data set is still ongoing. But you've seen from the literature, we have factors, processes, barriers, and facilitators. From our study, you have this extended orchestra metaphor, but really capturing the people involved, how they communicate with one another, the factors, emotions, and values they bring to bear on the decision, the fact that it's so broad, pluralistic, and polysemous, and the fact that there are these pressures and ways in which the decision-making process can fail. And I think there's a good deal of resonance between the two, potentially unsurprising, broadly the same population that we were examining, but these have persisted over time. Some of our studies were, of course, quite some years ago, the studies in the review. So just briefly to show you some of the points of comparison, points of similarity, and indeed synthesis, on the concept, we certainly are getting the sense, both from previous and our study, that these two little words capture a great deal, and they're not easy to pin down. It's a diverse concept, best interests, that is understood in diverse ways. And indeed, this leads me to briefly reflect on the short title of our project. So the project is Balancing Best Interests in Healthcare, Ethics and Law, short title Babel. And Babel is a biblical story in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Old Testament in Genesis. And basically it provides an origin story for the different languages of the world. And as I understand it, it essentially goes that originally all people in the world spoke a single language. And then they built this tower essentially to try and reach the heavens. In doing so, God disliked them doing so, and so condemned them all to thereafter be speaking different languages, and of course, thus potentially not understanding one another. I personally think what we're finding speaks to the value of that metaphor itself, that third metaphor, Babel, as a way of capturing what's going on in best interest decision-making. But back to the slide, in terms of our second area of comparison and similarity, we have points about the people involved, the participants. So best interest now is interpreted and applied by diverse participants who have diverse roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Thirdly, we know that best interest decisions are informed by participants' diverse values and indeed diverse emotions. And we've seen emotion feature both on the part of family members, perhaps most understandably, but it seemed also to feature in the literature we found in relation to healthcare professionals. And then finally, we've also seen various barriers, various deficits or failures, whether these are resources or information. So we're still unpicking what these messages are. We're still finalizing this analysis, and then we'll start to move to where do we go next? What sorts of recommendations emerge from these findings and indeed from the other parts of the project? So do watch this space on this. We hope to be publishing more on that in the coming year or so. But we'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on all of this. But I'll leave you with the words of indeed CBME's director, Julian Savulescu, working with Peter Singer a few years ago. And they were commenting on the critically ill infant Charlie Gard and the legal cases in the UK around such individuals. But I think the point stands in relation to adults too. In the absence of certainties, perhaps what we should do is break down what we mean by best interests and engage in an open debate about how they are best served. Perhaps, that's the Tower of Babel on the left there, perhaps we can find some way of coming back to a single language, a single way of understanding one another. But perhaps that's unduly optimistic. We shall see. Thank you all for listening, and have a wonderful few days at the conference. All the best.